Okay, we're going to get started with anatomy of a CGT launch, operationalizing cell and gene, excuse me.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the session this morning. Glad you guys didn't decide to hike Camelback for the last morning. We appreciate you attending. My name's Kyle Felmet. I'm Vice President of Specialty Commercialization with 2 Labs. I've been with 2 Labs for about 7 years. My background's really in specialty pharmacy, specialty distribution, patient services, really kind of the wraparound support services that you need to bring a product to market. I've been heavily focused in cell and gene for really the past kind of 5 to 7 years. And as an organization, as 2 Labs, really our why is to help manufacturers navigate the commercialization process and help them be ready for commercial approval. I'm excited about the panel today. We're going to talk about the anatomy of a cell and gene therapy launch. What are the nuances of what's going well, what's not going well, how can we improve, and really simplify the journey for cell and gene therapy patients and reach more patients in the market. We've all had a busy week. I'm sure everybody's had back-to-back meetings. But kind of the feeling I get here is there's kind of 2 sides of the coin right now in this space. I mean, one side, you can feel the buzz and the vibes around just the cell and gene market at this conference. The pipeline growth is significant. The number of products that have been launched is very significant. We've got over 20 cell and gene therapy products on the market today. Last year we had 5 unique gene therapy approvals in 1 year, which culminated in the approvals of Vertex and Bluebird sickle cell gene therapies in December. So a lot of excitement. But I think the other side of the coin, and probably half of the meetings that we had this week, is trying to solve challenges and issues. We've seen a lot of the CRLs or delays in this space recently have been tied to CMC manufacturing issues, so it's proven that it's been difficult to scale these products from a commercial manufacturing perspective. We also are all probably acutely aware, both as consumers and also as folks trying to build organizations and launch products, that the funding has been volatile and capital markets haven't necessarily agreed with us over the past really 2 to 3 years. So hopefully that changes next year in 25 and it softens a little bit, but there's still challenges out there. Regardless, I think the reason we wanted to really participate in this panel is to help drive the commercialization thinking forward. And I'm happy to have these folks on the panel today. Austin Fisher with Autolus. We've got Monet Stanford with Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, really focusing on the policy and market access side. And then Michael Storey with Nationwide Children. So good perspective to bring to the discussion. I'm going to pause with that and we'll jump into some questions, but I want to give them the opportunity just to introduce themselves and maybe state a little bit about their why in cell and gene therapy and kind of why they're up here on stage. Austin?
Austin Fisher, Vice President of Patient and Channel Access at Autolus. The why, I saw something about CAR T on 60 Minutes back in 2014 or 15, and that really energized me to get involved. So I found my way to Juneau and got a chance to launch 2 CAR T products there. And now at Autolus, hopefully to do all over again here very soon. So that first 60 Minutes episode really got me going, and now just the drive to see all the patients get access, and of course within my remit, managing travel and lodging and patient support programs, hearing the stories of patients who may not have gotten access, getting access, and that's very powerful for me.
That's perfect. So my name is Monet Stanford. I'm with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. And by way of you being here, I'm assuming you're familiar with the organization itself, but you may not be familiar with our U.S. policy and advocacy work, which now focuses more on access and reimbursement, whereas before the organization sort of focused on getting the drug over the FDA approval hurdle. We're really moving into that access and reimbursement space. But to kind of comment similarly to what Austin stated, I'm also a pharmacist like my colleague here, Michael. And what I love about my role at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine is really reflecting those patient stories to policymakers. Often drug pricing, healthcare kind of gets fit into this bucket with many other important priorities at the legislative level. And I like making sure that these legislators are aware that these are real patients facing real headwinds, and we have an opportunity as a community to express them to policymakers.
Hi, I'm Michael Storey. I'm from Nationwide Children's Hospital, where my role is medication use strategist. In that role, I coordinate our pharmacy and therapeutics committee, but I also lead the onboarding of new therapies around the organization, including gene and cell therapy, and also kind of maintain the operations and finances related to those therapies at the organization. So we've, Nationwide Children's, we were the original site for and the lab that Elevidys and Zolgensma came out of. So we have a lot of experience both in the research space, but then most of where I work is really as these products come to market and making sure that they're available to our patients and working with payers, internal stakeholders, and the manufacturers to make that happen.
Excellent. So we're going to go through a couple different buckets. I think we'll start kind of in the pre-launch and launch execution phase. And Austin, I'll start with you with the first question. How early should a manufacturer be thinking about the commercial planning, and what are some of the first things you feel they should be thinking about in the pre-launch process?
Having done 2 onboarding programs for 2 different companies, 18 to 24 months prior to your potential PDUFA seems about right. And you may want to even think a little bit before that, because it's common for what you've done in the clinical trial to end up in your label. It's very hard to change these, especially from an autologous standpoint, these GXP, GMP processes closer to launch. So when you get to your customers and you're doing your onboarding and you find out something doesn't quite work, you may not have time to fix it. So things like, what does your technical qualification look like? How far are you going to go? What's your scope there? What is the product configuration? Product configuration impacts everything. From a distribution standpoint, patient support, how you bill it, how the NDC structure is, how the center loads it in their EMR, EHR, what do the order sets look like, the treatment plans look like. It really just spiderwebs into all different areas. And then when you're trying to explain how the product works at the center, it's much easier to have more of a defined one billable NDC. Maybe you have a outer wrap with multiple NDCs inside. So I think product configuration is a very important one. And clinical outcomes is paramount, but there's usually some flexibility if you're thinking ahead of time to package your product in a way where it works in an environment that is really still living in a traditional pharma product space. We're trying to make these cell and gene and CAR Ts work in systems that were designed for off-the-shelf products. So that's something to always keep in mind. How do you make it work for that environment?
Perfect. Monet, I'll go to you next. From more of a policy consideration standpoint, any potential hurdles that manufacturers should be aware of in that pre-launch process, to ensure access and navigate the reimbursement landscape?
Absolutely. Each of the elements that Austin mentioned have a policy component. So just acknowledging when you're early stage that if you build it, they will come approach likely won't work. Acknowledging that you'll probably have different payer mixes. So your considerations in Medicare, as he mentioned with the bundled payment system, may have different earlier stage opportunities that you might think of when you are considering a primarily commercial population. And the Medicaid population, you'll have to prepare yourself to engage with 50 individual state Medicaid programs, which is completely different than, again, a commercial population. So just acknowledging that bringing the policy in on the forefront is important, and that it's a very dynamic industry. So in Medicare, inpatient, outpatient, Medicare physician fee schedules change at a cyclical level. So what you're evaluating in 2024 is going to be a completely different environment in 2027 when your product might launch. So just making sure you affiliate yourself with organizations like the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, where we push these policy proposals out and incorporate that into your strategies early on.
Michael, from your perspective in the pre-launch process, anything from a treatment center standpoint you would provide advice for?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of engagement, there's like what I would consider early engagement, and then there's later engagement. So I think early engagement, there's a couple different things. One is just kind of talking to a couple of the centers and really understanding, in general, what are some of the things that centers might be expecting or needing. I think, to some of what Austin was saying about, thinking about your presentation of the product. I think that's something that talking to a few key opinion leaders is, I think, helpful. I think that it's important to not just talk to PIs and clinician experts in the area, but really getting in touch with folks in pharmacy and in finance, because at the end of the day, I find that when I talk with centers across the country, it's not the physicians that are the ones who are slowing down the process. It's usually that there's logistical issues that the physicians are completely unaware of and unable to address themselves that are really the problem. And so I think trying to get ahead of that and build those relationships is important. I always advise people that finding the key person in pharmacy is helpful. And one of the ways that I tell people to do that, here's just a little tip if you're looking for this online, is go and look at their pharmacy residency website. And a lot of times they'll have contact information for key members of their leadership team, including their chief pharmacy officer or directors. And I think that a lot of times that will help you find the right people to really engage with at those organizations.
Great. Maybe switching to a similar topic, but a little different. So treatment center readiness, patient-specific logistics, the management of that process. Austin, are there any best practices you've learned approaching with QTCs or ATCs or treatment centers from your perspective with your multiple launches?
Kind of similar to what Michael was saying around having the right folks at the table. What we do is when we start engaging a center, we have to have a clinical champion, we have to have an admin champion, a finance champion, and somebody from procurement or finance and/or pharmacy. If you don't have these folks at the table, it's very hard to move forward because each one of them has their own specialty area that they're focused on. I think also best practices is, especially in autologous space, is stay within your lane, have very tight scope. If the center is a supplier of your manufacturing process, ergo apheresis, really focus on the qualifications that are right for them. There's been a lot of activity with the 80/20 initiative on streamlining this, recognizing centers that have FITES accreditation and not putting them through these arduous auditing protocols because they've already done that for FACT. And so leveraging the FACT environment is very key. I think being prepared is also very important. Don't go to a center or a treatment center if you don't quite have all your ducks in a row on how you're partly delivered, kind of how you're going to operate with them. Who is their point of contact? What does the field team look like? These are all critical pieces of information that they're going to need. And then the last piece I would say from a contracting standpoint, I've seen a big range. I've seen 60-page master agreements for a CAR T, and I've seen 4. So they do run the range. Find the one that's right and that really operates on kind of respect of experience and a partnership.
And Mike, you've got great perspective on this. Anything to add to that? And
yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the more streamlined that you can make, qualification processes, like Austin said, the better. I mean, we've had some companies that I feel like we were basically going through a FACT accreditation again in order to onboard their product, and then others that it's been considerably less. And so I think really focusing on what is necessary for this product. So, any drug product gets administered. It gets delivered, it gets stored, it gets administered. That's not unique just because you have an autologous cell therapy and, or an allogeneic cell therapy or an AAV gene therapy. So you can, if you want to do a quick tour or something like that, that's one thing, but, demanding edits to their policies on how they store products and things like that is pretty over the top, I would say. Obviously, in the supplier situation for autologous cells, that's a little bit different in that you have to know how the product is being sent to you as a manufacturer. But I think that you have to think about the downstream processes as not being substantially different from another therapy. And so I think that's a really important thing to streamline. The agreements, definitely the more complex you make them, the longer it's going to take to onboard therapies. I think we've seen, some therapies take a really considerable amount of time even after launch before we see patients moving forward in the commercial space. And I think a lot of that is because getting treatment centers up and running is a drawn out process, especially if you make the agreements and the processes around site qualification more arduous.
Can I add something to that?
yeah, please.
One emerging theme that I've been seeing, comparing to 2017 when I got involved in this industry, is IT security assessments. Back in 2017, 2018, there was so much energy around this new modality of treatment that there wasn't a pause on the IT security assessment side. And now we're seeing a lot more of that, the industry is. So I think getting that, when you start engaging with your treatment center from a pharma standpoint, getting that requirement on day one, if you can, because that can take months to complete. And it's all a good cause. It's making sure the data is secure and the patient's information is protected when it's being transferred among different parties. So it's the right thing to do, but start earlier.
Yeah, I've heard about some companies that will, some hospitals, they'll like look at the inspection in more depth than others, for sure. And like I know one colleague who they were dissatisfied with where the server's hosted worldwide. So it's like there's some things like that where it can be built securely, but are there countries that hospital may not necessarily want their data going over to? There's challenges with that, and so I think just trying to think about different different things that could be a rate limiter, which obviously that's in choosing partners probably well before launch, I think is a really important thing to think about. It's not just what you're comfortable with; it's what your customers are going to be comfortable with.
Yeah. Go ahead. Did another thing? Maybe this is a question for just open to the panel. As we're looking at the pipeline, we're seeing kind of this shift a little bit from the ultra rare disease to more, broader, potentially larger patient populations. You think about sickle cell and some other diseases that are in the pipeline. We're also seeing a little bit of a shift from, predominantly inpatient to more potential for outpatient setting. Any thoughts for the audience on just what we should be thinking about from a commercialization standpoint as you see those potential shifts in the market?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, as we see some of the sickle cell therapies, we expect that will create a different level of volume, at least at some centers, than we've seen with other cell therapies. Certainly you have large cancer centers that are already doing, 100 plus CAR T patients a year, but those are few and far between. Sickle cell is still also, I don't expect to roll out at, that pace at any institution based on a whole variety of factors. We generally anticipate treating 1% to 2% of our sickle cell population on an annual basis, at least out of the gate. But it does lead to a lot of questions around, normally we'll have like one of these therapies sitting on our shelf at a time because we basically bring it in and administer it. The more of these products that you have, the more sophisticated operations you have to develop within your organization to just kind of make it more of a everyday practice versus kind of a special thing that you have a few people who do it and you just kind of trust those people. We know that there's more need for some standardization there. Trying to think if there was something else in that question that I was going to say. I don't know.
That was perfect.
Good.
Well, if I can add to that, and those are totally spot on. When I first started in CAR T, we first started hearing about, one portal, then another. And if you talk about 10 therapies, just use an even number, and 5 manufacturers, adding to the 5 manufacturers out there now your 10 portals, your 10 qualification processes. This explosion of available cell and gene therapies is not realistic for centers under the current structure. Standardization will have to happen. Otherwise, my take is you'll see a blockade because people just won't have the capacity anymore.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead.
And we've just been thinking through some policies that can support that standardization. Thematically throughout this conference, we've heard that the science, the commercialization, the availability of these assets have outpaced where we are from a structural standpoint. Legislatively, we've been advocating for the Accelerating Kids Access to Care, which focuses on the provider credentialing portion for out-of-state Medicaid beneficiaries. Of course, we were influential in developing CMMI, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation's CGT access model, which of course is limited in scope now, but it does create a framework that we can build off of as these new therapies come onto market. And I think your question also kind of addressed how we're going to transition to the outpatient setting. We think about that a lot, specifically in Medicare. Right now, primarily, the cell and gene therapies administered in Medicare are mapped to a DRG bundled payment. That system worked great in 2017 when it was just CAR-Ts, but now we have a litany of options. It pays out right now at just over $250,000. Obviously, we have a range of price points that aren't going to be able to fit into that bundle, and that's inpatient. So overall, at ARM, we do our best to make sure our policies reflect our desire to ensure that reimbursement policy doesn't overshadow clinical decision making, so we want to make sure there's flexibility. So we're working through the DRG issue, but we're also working through what does outpatient administration look like for Medicare patients where perhaps it's more favorable for a provider. We would not want that to be the driver of a clinical decision versus what that patient-provider relationship looks like.
Yeah, I think in general, we see a lot of challenges in that reimbursement space. And I think, especially with cellular therapies, I would say with AAV therapies that are given outpatient from a hospital standpoint, I think we're able to create adequate margin to support the programs. I would suggest that the margin that we're currently able to generate with cell therapies across the board, especially in an inpatient setting, is inadequate to actually create a sustainable framework. And I think you have a lot of freestanding children's hospitals like where I work, or academic medical centers, who are often on this path of we must offer the most cutting edge therapies, we want to offer it, and if that just means that we barely break even or even lose a little bit of money, maybe we're okay with that. As you think about some of these therapies expanding more broadly into community centers, that's not going to be a viable framework. And so I think that health systems have to be able to create the margin in order to do the operational things that are necessary to provide these therapies. And so, yeah, the DRG framework is pretty problematic. There's other issues with the outpatient framework, but certainly from a hospital finance standpoint, it's more favorable. I think this, to Austin's point about standardization of portals, and I think what I hear from manufacturers routinely is, we have a great portal. It's really simple and it's really easy to use, and I hear this about patient support programs and other things too. And the reality is that they're not wrong. Their programs are simple and easy to use, and their portals are usually pretty easy to use, or at least not too challenging. But the problem is that there's a whole bunch of them. And so, the other one is also easy to use. And I think if anything that we could do to standardize that, I think would be helpful. If manufacturers wanted to get together and say, hey, we can create some scale here, or at a bare minimum, use like Microsoft single sign-on to get into it, so that I don't have to make up a new password that I won't remember, for every portal. Because right now, I will tell you, there are portals that every time I go in, I have to reset my password because I just can't remember all of them.
Great feedback. I also have the same challenges on my computer. So maybe sticking a little bit, Monet, with the pricing topic and cost, maybe from your perspective with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, I know you don't like the term innovative reimbursement models, but other things that the policy initiatives around that to help with the upfront high cost of these therapies, anything you'd have to speak to that, maybe that consideration?
Yes, and I don't like the term innovative pricing models. In the same way I don't like framing cell and gene therapies as innovative per se, although we know that they are at their baseline. The intention is to democratize access to these therapies. So yes, they're new, but at some point monoclonal antibodies are new, and now they're commonplace. So yes, innovative pricing models like outcomes-based arrangements, subscription models, warranty models, theoretically they're different from what the current state of play is, but essentially we're just offering opportunities for flexibility. That's what we're looking for. So I think I mentioned earlier the CMMI, CGT access model, and to expand on that, because ARM has advocated a lot with both the administration in terms of the presidential administration and the CMS on what that looks like, and of course we're still shaping that. But essentially what this does is eliminate the need for a manufacturer to go state to state to execute an outcomes-based arrangement. And that also eliminates the need for each individual state Medicaid agency to negotiate with pricing with a particular organization. Right now, it's limited to the cell and gene therapies that offer a product for severe sickle cell disease. But what I think is important about this model is it's great that we've consolidated the ability for the agency to work through and standardize, as we're talking about standardization, some of these contracts. But it's also all of the ancillary work that went around the CGT access model. So now there are mandatory access standards, there are mandatory supports, that includes travel and lodging, that includes other clinical aspects specific to sickle cell disease. But what's important about that to me is that we now have the administration on record establishing that these are issues. So we don't want to create a disparity between the sickle cell disease population and other potential beneficiaries of cell and gene therapies. So our work at ARM has been working directly with the agency to sort of expand what some of those access standards look like. We just recently had the final Medicaid drug rebate program rule where they changed the definition of a covered outpatient drug, which is very wonky, but essentially in Medicaid, where typically a therapy might be bundled in order to have a hospital make sure that they don't lose money on the particular product, they pull it out and separate it and then bill Medicaid separately. That potentially may now be caused with this recent Medicaid rule that we're still reviewing. And that's concerning because having separate payment is the mechanism that you need to execute an outcomes-based agreement. So not only will you potentially lose money on the product, you also don't have this other option for an innovative pricing arrangement. So we've been working with the agency to understand what this might mean, but we've also been doing a little bit of stakeholder engagement because as we've engaged with hospital communities, we've been getting differing reactions. To Michael's point, an academic medical institution is completely different from a community-based institution, and how this might impact them is still undetermined. So we've been working to understand where we might have pricing and reimbursement models by way of legislative and regulatory frameworks that limit access, or if anything, prevent expansion of treatment centers. And rarely are you gonna hear a hospital come back and say, I'm not offering that CAR T therapy because I'm gonna lose money. So it's very challenging for us to gather data to really present this to policymakers to show that it's a problem. But again, that's why we're kind of raising the red flag, since it is a very complicated issue within this community to kind of coalesce that. That is the intention of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine's membership structure. We have therapeutic developers, we have tool and service providers, but we also have academic medical institutions, patient voices, provider voices that we all use to bring into this one policy framework to advocate for things that bring access to cell and gene therapies.
Yeah, Michael, maybe I'll turn it to you. I mean, how is the treatment center thinking about outcome-based agreements?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of cases, the biggest thing that that institutions want is for that to be usually simple. I will say that I think that hospitals are often the party left out of the discussion of outcomes-based agreements. And if you intend to execute your outcomes-based agreement based on claims data or something like that, that's all well and good. But if you actually need the hospital to report data in order to have that outcomes-based agreement become a reality, I think hospitals need to be at the table. Certainly, I think one of the things that can't continue to become a normal thing is making the hospital hold the bag on the money while waiting for that outcome to be determined as a positive or a negative. So you can't say, and there are outcomes-based agreements out there, that it's like you have to hold your bill until you determine if this outcome is met. Well, if you're doing that, you're gonna have to make sure that your payment terms are similarly adjusted for the hospital to be able to realize that. You can't make us the bag holder with no upside in doing that. I think the other part of it is that if you want good outcomes, you have to figure out how you're going to incentivize hospitals to actually report those outcomes. And I would actually submit to you that I don't think that's just your qualified treatment centers. I think that that is any center that routinely treats these patients. And if you want to go longer term, you might need to even look beyond that, because we hope for some of these therapies that these are cures. We hope that they're not necessarily seeing, a specialist for some of these diseases, 10 years out or something. And so depending on how far out you want to go with that, you may need to actually be thinking about that. But I will also say that, this also applies if you have something where you have a limited number of treatment centers and you have patients who need to come from far and away, a lot of those patients are going to stop following up at the qualified treatment center, are going to go somewhere else. I would submit to you that I do not think that having 5 treatment centers for a therapy is a actually commercially viable strategy. I think there are companies out there that have done that. But the reality is that between issues with Medicaid, which I know Monet has talked about, we're working on trying to allow portability between states. But fundamentally, there are states that still don't want to pay even what it costs the hospital to procure the drug for the drug. There are states that have different coverage policies at the end of the day. And then even with commercial policies, there's issues where they don't want to send patients out of state. And so I really think that you're not going to have a treatment center in every state. But I certainly think that saying that patients have to travel 1,000 or 1,500 miles to get a therapy is unreasonable. And certainly, if you want good outcomes, it's just not going to happen. If you want good outcomes-based agreements, it's not going to happen.
And if I might, just one thing that has sort of stymied the rollout of increased outcomes-based agreements is another issue in Medicaid around best price reporting, where a company has to report all of the prices that they offer across the supply chain, and Medicaid has to get the best price. At a regulatory level, CMS has effectuated the multiple best price program, where if you're under an outcomes-based agreement or some other contracting arrangement, for example, one quarter, your price might be $0 just because you paid at the outset, and so quarter by quarter, you might not have something to report. So they fixed that issue by creating the multiple best price approach, and now there's legislation, it's bicameral, bipartisan, and we're hoping to see that walk by the end of the year in an end of the year package. But that's the MVP Act, the Most Valued Patients Act, and that codifies that regulatory allowance. So now there's less concern, and it also addresses some of the concerns around ASP reporting and that balance. So I think that's another important legislative action that we can do to ensure that outcomes-based arrangements continue to proliferate.
Excellent. Just lastly on the value-based, maybe Austin, anything from a manufacturer's perspective around value-based pricing or outcomes-based agreements that you would add there?
I was thinking about Michael's comment around payment terms, because while that's all working itself out, somebody owes money in that moment because title's transferred. And typically, as I mentioned earlier, we're still living in a traditional pharmaceutical world infrastructure. And usually what manufacturers will do is they'll do a fair market value on payment terms. So when you're dealing with these kind of value-based agreements, outcomes-based agreements, you'll need to kind of approach the FMV of payment terms a little bit different. And have some more concrete, reasonable assumptions about how you can kind of pass the red face test if you were ever audited on what kind of payment term you gave and why you gave it. That was one thing that came to mind. Yeah.
Excellent. Switch a little bit to distribution strategy, supply chain, which we all know is complex, and the scalability of that. Austin, back to you. You've launched a couple CAR-Ts. You're working on another launch. How is launching a cell and gene therapy product from a distribution and supply chain perspective different than maybe some of us that have just worked on a specialty drug launch?
The current CAR-T marketplace is dominated by the 3PLs. And that was established kind of in 17 and 18. And it does tie back a little bit to the standardization comment I made earlier. If these pathways have been established and centers are having their normal process and protocols, offering a new solution to them isn't always the best for them, because now they have a new buying pathway for that particular cell and gene and CAR-T product. I think from a specialty product standpoint, or just stepping back and thinking about how you choose what path you're going to take is, what's the patient out-of-pocket exposure look like, and what's the acceptable buying patterns of your customers. So some treatment centers will not accept white bagging, for example. That's not within their policy. It's not allowed. And there's reasons for that. I'm sure Michael will speak to that here in a moment. The patient out-of-pocket exposure piece, very critical. A patient's out-of-pocket exposure from a pharmacy to a medical benefit, Medicare versus commercial, varies widely. So you see more of a buy and bill medical benefit being the quote-unquote safest out-of-pocket exposure for a patient, assuming this is more of a chronic patient. Some acute patients do get surprised, and maybe they didn't have a great plan or a plan that's outside of the Affordable Care Act rules. But I would say those are the two key components that differ from specialty. Probably more so looking at the cost of these therapies, and you don't want to present a patient with an $80,000 copay. So, which could happen in a scenario where they have no out-of-pocket cap and operating on a pharmacy benefit.
Very good. Michael, maybe from your perspective, I mean, the uniqueness of the characteristics of a cell and gene therapy product, we're talking liquid nitrogen, dry ice, ultra cold chain. Any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's a lot of things in terms of storage that we have to have new considerations for. The pandemic made it so that virtually every major hospital now has a -80 freezer in their pharmacy. So if you're, a lot of the AAV products can or should be stored in -80 upon arrival. But liquid nitrogen, so at Nationwide Children's, we manage cell therapies at the time that they arrive back to the hospital from the manufacturer as drugs. We receive them into the pharmacy. We have a liquid nitrogen freezer in the pharmacy. We store them there and we dispense them as drugs. I would argue that that is the way that it ought to be. And I will have a vigorous debate with anyone who wants to have that about the role of a cell lab in that. But the reality is that I think the dispensing activity ought to be done through the pharmacy, at least in some capacity. It may need to be stored in a cell lab or something, but there needs to be a pharmacy oversight of dispensing. But we have, so there's a lot of those unique issues. I think in terms of the buy and bill versus specialty pharmacy, we are a buy and bill only facility at this point. We really say, if you agree to do white bagging of these therapies, you are transitioning, you are guaranteeing you're going to lose money on every case you do as a hospital. Now, you might only lose a small amount of money, but you will lose money on every case. And as we think about this at scale, it's not a viable strategy. So to me, we have to figure out ways that we are able to create margin, adequate margin to cover our expenses of having those products. If you send it through a specialty pharmacy, they don't have a liquid nitrogen freezer that they have to maintain. In fact, for many of these products, they don't even open the liquid nitrogen dewar when they're dispensing it, which is, I think, a pretty crazy thing, actually, in accordance with state pharmacy law, because they look at a picture to dispense it, not look at the actual drug product. But nonetheless, that happens. I think you have a lot of, so ultimately, the center has to do a lot of the handling, and so they have to actually be able to, subsidize those services. And so I think finding ways to make that viable for centers is really critical. I know there are centers who want to de-risk and pass that off. I just don't think that's a viable strategy at scale.
Can I add to that?
Please.
One thing I'd add to that, and we discussed this yesterday, is when you expand these markets past these academic centers and the price of the therapy is $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 plus, there might be a role for a different intermediary to de-risk for that particular center. But to Michael's point, there would then need to be billing codes for them to apply to be able to be made whole on the administration of the product. So there could be a role here. You think about some of these clinical trials in very wide spaces, maybe taking them out of these sophisticated treatment centers or the transplant centers. There could be that need to de-risk the revenue cycle for them.
Yeah, and we've kept line of sight on different opportunities to pursue that, including some national pharmacy chains that already have these large distribution centers set up for other types of similar services. So that's something that we've been thinking about. And then just putting my pharmacist hat back on, I was thinking about how the product is regulated and at the state level in terms of state pharmacy practice laws. And that's something we also think about at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. Of course, these are therapies that go through the FDA, so they're regulated as drugs and biologics, but we compare them more often to transplants or something that you would do for a neonatal patient. So perhaps we should think more about the way they're regulated so that we can take away some of these very restrictive approaches and allow the pharmacists and others to practice at the top of their license in attempting to get these patients through the system, these drugs through the system to patients.
I will say that I think some of the things, if you want to get these things into community health systems, that is where the model that I talk about, that we actually run it through our pharmacy, is actually the model that will have to become the norm at a lot of these community hospitals. And so I think thinking about how that will work is really important. And yeah, I mean, even for AAV gene therapies, if you white bag that, you're going to then infuse it, and you're going to get a $200 infusion fee or something like that from the payer. That's not sufficient to support all of the rigmarole of procurement, storage, administration, and there's obviously different billables for appointments pre and post, but there's a lot of coordination of care that's unreimbursed as well. So a lot of that has to be considered, and that can be, like Austin said, that could be through a different mechanism of billing for those centers, but there has to be some sort of remuneration in order to make that viable.
Perfect. So shifting a little bit to, as we transition to potentially larger patient populations, Monet, as we think about larger patient populations, potentially more chronic indications, autoimmunes in the pipeline as well, is there anything from a policy standpoint or framework that you guys are working on or we should be thinking about that maybe to address the larger patient populations?
We've just been doing our best to reflect the unique nature of individual cell and gene therapy, since they're often kind of bucketed together, and each indication has its own set of clinical considerations. So from a policy perspective, for example, in Medicare around some of the oncology products, we're working through this issue with coding where right now, as the policy stands, essentially all of the leukapheresis, all of the pre-administration services are bucketed into one code. But as we've discussed, transitioning into outpatient administration, these services may happen at different touch points, but because they're all bundled into one code, only one particular entity would be reimbursed for that. So we think about sort of making sure policymakers know that there are specific considerations for each individual therapy. And then as a community, we've just been making sure that the windfall or the lightning strike of the new therapies doesn't seem imminent and generates any fear, which is very easy to do in Congress, generate fear around some type of pricing thing. So we've been trying to be very specific on what that pipeline looks like, what the pricing point looks like, how things are working in the commercial market that we plan to bring into public pricing frameworks. And I think that's been effective on an individual congressman by congressman basis. But I don't know if you've heard, there's an election this year. So we have a lot to do in January to really re-educate. But we actually think no matter what the outcome of the election looks like, there's an opportunity for innovation in science and really introducing what that looks like. So we plan to sort of set some roots there and then trickle that down into some of the regulatory work that we're doing.
That's great. Michael, from your perspective, as you think about maybe more patients coming to the center, any thoughts on how you're preparing or thinking about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the key things that centers have to work on is actually getting payer contracts that that persist across patients. So rather than having to do single case agreements, getting away from that as much as possible is really where we have to be in order to be able to offer this at scale. And so, we've done that pretty successfully at our center with Zolgensma, but there's still a long way to go for most of the other therapies, and that certainly can create delays in care. And it's just at scale, doing single case agreements for a handful of patients a year is not a big deal. When you start talking about the potential of doing that for dozens of patients a year, it's really pretty overwhelming for our payer team. And so I think that that's definitely one thing. I think the other thing that as a society we have to address is, particularly with employer-sponsored health plans, getting clauses out that say gene therapy is an excluded benefit. This actually ultimately will raise the cost of care for some of those patients if the plan ultimately decides to pay for it. But I will tell you that if I were to go and ask every vendor here to show me their employee health plan, I would venture to guess there are vendors here who have, and other companies who have members here represented, who have exclusions in their plans for gene therapy. They don't know that. The people who are here don't know that. So I would give everyone this homework. Go home, ask for your employee benefit plan. It's like a 100-page document, and look in the exclusions section and see if it says gene therapy. Because I can tell you I've seen small businesses and Fortune 100 companies exclude that, including companies that want to be in this space. And so trying to really address that is, I think, a really key thing, because ultimately that delays patient access. And there's not a clear policy for that, because ERISA allows them to do a whole lot of different things with their plans. But it's really hard when I have to tell a patient, yeah, your insurance doesn't cover this. There's different ways we get around that, but none of them are fun, and none of them are easy, and none of them are fast.
Excellent. I think so. Before we kind of open it up for Q&A, maybe just one last kind of closing thought from each of you guys. If you think about where we're headed with the growth in this space, if you have a crystal ball, anything we should think about for cell and gene therapy over the next 5 to 10 years, where we might be, or major things we should consider?
I think a groundswell of kind of repeating what I said earlier on standardization. Some of the talks I've been to at this meeting, if these therapies make it to fruition, to commercialization, you're talking huge demand on apheresis chairs, huge demand on kind of process SOPs and technology at these centers, and even beyond. Community that really have no play in this today. There'll need to be some really hard looks at, on the autologous side, especially the apheresis process. Maybe some third-party folks need to come in and augment some of these centers. And technology-wise, there has to be standardization. I just don't see in 5 years if just 20%, I think we had a slide at the opening that about 18% make it to commercialization. If that happens with some of these patient populations, it could be pretty cataclysmic for the treatment center side of the house.
And then, like most predictions for the future, I'm really excited about the way artificial intelligence will impact the CGT community, not just from a drug discovery perspective, but also thinking about digital health solutions that can help, like continue to offer outcomes for these outcomes-based agreements, or digital health solutions that help patients communicate with their provider, that can also offer feedback that we can use to strengthen reducing toxicities for these medications and also strengthening their clinical impact. And then secondly, I'm most excited for their transition to outpatient, more accessible facilities, not even just in the United States, but beyond.
I think at health systems, what we're going to see the evolution of are what we'll call centers of excellence or something like that. We at Nationwide Children's, we started our Gene Therapy Center of Excellence last year. I co-founded that and co-direct it currently. The goal of that is to create some of the institutional standardization, create shared resources so that every service line who has a new gene therapy approved, it doesn't have to write their own new policies, have their own, hire their own new staff, especially if you have, kind of some of these boom bust cycles with some of these therapies where you have kind of your, prevalent population and then it moves to more of an incident population and numbers might decline. You don't really want to hire on new staff, just facilitate that in the near term. So we've done some different things like that. And ultimately that will create standardized processes to, at an institutional level. So I think that's something that we'll see. I know of a handful of centers that have currently initiated those types of programs. I think that that's something that we will start to see more commonly among large academic medical centers and large freestanding pediatric hospitals.
Great. Well, I just want to say thank you to all three of you for being here and preparing for this discussion. I thought it was thorough. And thanks to the audience for attending. I think we're kind of close to time. I'll just open it up for any questions from the audience before we close. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Hi, Michael. So do you have any provisions to share the infrastructure for your research to your commercialization so that you're not necessarily taking a brand new group of people to train them on how to use these new therapies, but it's kind of a seamless continuum?
Yeah, so our Gene Therapy Center of Excellence does cross over between our research institute and our commercial therapies. So we have a number of the people who are involved in those trials. A number of our PIs sit on that, as well as some of the others who are involved in the trials. And then some of our nurse practitioners that we've hired for that center actually have both are on some of the research protocols as well as some of the commercial protocols. So yeah, for us, a lot of that is pretty seamless. Certainly we have like a clinical trials unit where a lot of these things are administered, so there's some translation that has to happen, to kind of more of a commercial space, but we're able to kind of use some of those existing policies and, sometimes engage some of the staff who are involved in the research protocols to really help train the commercial staff. I really actually think that in general, we have good policies already in place for AAV, so I feel like we have staff who are comfortable in both the commercial and the research space. For cell therapy, it's all done in the same area. So all of our cell therapy we currently do inpatient. So it's all on the inpatient bone marrow transplant unit. It's the same nurses, same nurse practitioners who are doing that either from research or from commercial. And so I think we have a lot of shared resources already that are doing it. But I definitely think that there's a lot of value. And I think as we saw some of the earlier therapies come out, that was something that was really important to us, is kind of saying, okay, how do we do this in the trial? Does it work? Yes. And we do that outside of gene and cell therapy too. We were the only North American trial site for Brineura, which is a enzyme replacement therapy infused into the intraventricular space. And that was something that was new and unique that we had to train a new set of staff on. And I think that's something that we try to do across the enterprise. Yep.
Any other questions? We have one in the back.
Hi, this question is for Michael. You had mentioned that one of the therapies was a little bit easier to manage over the others. Would you be able to provide a little bit of information about some of the factors that go into that? Is it that your internal team is more used to, the workflow and engaging the payers and the internal SOPs, or is it support from the manufacturer that made it a little bit easier?
So I think when I said that, I think I was referring to some of the onboarding processes. So I mean, I think it really, there can be factors in terms of what they want us to do that I will say may be institution specific. There may be things that I prefer that another institution may prefer the way that someone else does it. But a lot of it is how much you want to scrutinize processes that I really think fall outside of what I think is actually necessary for a qualified treatment center process. So, the reality is that we can't spend 5 staff members' time for 3 days each getting ready for every one of these therapies just to have a meeting so that we can get a stamp of approval. And so I think that there have been more and less successful ones. Certainly we're gonna have some prep time, we expect that. We expect to have some engagement, but it can't be at the level that some companies want. I will say we have a lot of these meetings where companies come in and they say, we want this person and this person and this person in these meetings, and we often will pare those down and say, like, I'll join the meeting and then I'll have follow-ups with other people that are 5 and 10 minute meetings, rather than having our vice president of revenue cycle sit through an hour-long meeting that 5 or 10 minutes is relevant for him. And so I think there's different things like that I think companies need to be aware of. We have to be thinking about a lot of different things that are going on in our organizations. This week I spent 40 hours last week just trying to manage a fluid shortage. That has nothing to do with cell and gene therapy. There's other things that are going on in our worlds, and I think that has to be kind of appreciated as well.
Thanks. Julie Walls-Jensen, I represent the payer community. I found this conversation really interesting, and thank you for all of your comments. I appreciate the efforts that are being done on the government-funded areas. I was very excited about the CMMI, cell and gene access model, and I think the foundation and structure is really going to drive innovation and reimbursement and engagement for those populations. I also appreciated, Michael, your commentary about coverage concerns on commercial payers, specifically the self-funded employer groups, that being a challenge, and recognize there's a need for advocacy and education in explaining the huge variety of cell and gene therapies, including cost, complexity for administration, et cetera. I think what we have to recognize, and I'd like to just raise awareness to this group at large, is the importance of standardization. As you all talk about it, you're coming from your own lens of standardizing operational procedures for medical centers, providers, outpatient, the biopharmaceuticals. The need for standardization and the need for efficiency in the payer model is huge. And when you start thinking about the multiple payers that could touch this and start contemplating patient migration within commercial insurers, but also between commercial and government insurers, it's a significant challenge, especially when you start thinking about value-based reimbursement structures and other alternative payment mechanisms. So we have a lot of work to do. And I'm really excited about engaging in that work, but I wanted to point out that perspective and the importance of remembering that work is significant. That work in the payer side requires significant resource investment as well. IT data analytics, claims platforms redesign, policy and procedure development, all while competing with other challenging issues, within the healthcare industry at large. So I think this is exciting, and I look forward to having more dialogue with all of you.
Yeah, I'll just comment on standardization in the payer space. One of the things I see is in the prior authorization process as well. I have payers that I work with regularly that they very much understand how their systems work, but when I have a patient who comes from 2 states away, even if they're on a plan that I work with routinely, in our region, it may be a completely different process. And so even finding who it is I'm supposed to talk to in order to get approval for that, it can be really challenging. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, to do a benefits investigation is not standardized. Just to do a prior authorization. I mean, a lot of these are running through transplant networks or other areas, but some payers are saying, yeah, AAV gene therapies just run through like anything else. Others have this you need to call this special number. And so trying to find some of that, I think, is a real challenge. And again, at scale, for both the payer as well as for the health systems, this is definitely a real challenge, is the lack of standardization. Then how the bill goes out. There's different expectations from different payers and and different sites, how they want to bill it or how they want to send the bill. And there has to be standardization in order to actually as these things scale, for sure. There's a lot of hand-holding right now on this at both the payer end and on the site end. Like, we have very manual tracking and processing of these, and so it's like literally at Ohio Medicaid, it's like I know the person I email, to check in on it, or if they say, hey, you need to resubmit this for this. I talked with this person regularly. That's not a scalable method, right? And I think we all acknowledge that. It's just trying to figure out how that works. Granted, we probably bill more to Ohio Medicaid than any other center in our state, so that's a little bit different. But nonetheless, yeah, there's a lot that has to happen there.
And one mechanism that we've been thinking about in our journey to standardization is ensuring that there's transparency amongst all partners along the way. In terms of Medicaid, one area where we've been focusing on standardization is around access. So in Medicaid, it's required that all FDA-approved products are covered. That does not mean that the individual patient has access at launch. So Ohio Medicaid has a great program. Michigan has a great program. New York, Massachusetts, they have great program. But again, these are federally funded programs, so why is there so much variability? And our understanding comes from the sophistication of the particular drug utilization review board, or the perceived sophistication, and how long it takes for them to develop their coverage and access policies, their prior authorization standards, et cetera, and then the downstream impacts when a patient is trying to come on board. Most of the Medicaid patients indicated for gene therapies are rare diseases that are diagnosed at newborn screening. They don't have the 6 to 18 months, which is the current average to get a cellular gene therapy onboarded with state Medicaid programs. So that's one area where there are federal levers where you can impact standardization.
All right, I think that's it. Thank you guys for attending, and we'll see you later on at the conference. Thank you.